Mail order bride on the bay. Chapter 6. Ducking, Zeke narrowly missed being hit by a flying plate. Luckily all of his dishes, what few he had, were enameled tin, so it bounced off the wall with a ping. "What in tarnation is wrong with you, wife? Don't you call me your wife, you liar," she cried, grabbing a metal cup in each fist and raising them above her head. "You are my wife, and I demand you stop throwing things." Another volley of plates, a pan, and a wooden spoon flew at him. She was breathing hard and he feared she'd hurt herself. "Ramona, I never lied to you. Quit your shenanigans right this minute. Don't you ever tell me what to do." The shelf where his kitchenwares had been stowed was now empty and she turned to a narrow cupboard. The first thing there was a canning jar of pickles which she hefted experimentally in her hand. "Don't throw that, woman. It'll make a bad mess and stink up the place of vinegar." "Oh, no," she said, rolling her eyes and cocking a hip. If she hadn't the round ball of a middle full of baby, he might have found her posture alluring, but instead she looked silly. "We wouldn't want to make your fine ranch," she trilled the R in an exaggerated fashion, "smell of pickles." He could feel it coming, but it surprised him just the same when a laugh escaped his mouth. She put her fists on her hips and glared at him. "What are you laughing at?" That only served to make him laugh harder. He doubled over, shoulders shaking, and tears ran from his eyes. "Stop it. Stop laughing." She set the large jar on the tabletop, a piece of furniture he'd built himself from raw wood and just that morning had scrubbed clean in preparation for her arrival. He wiped the tears away and struggled to gain control. She was standing on the other side of the table, her shawl now on the floor, and where her hair had been neatly combed back from her smooth brow it now was pulled free, wisps of black silk floating around her face. "Now that you are calmed down, Ramona, tell me how you think I lied." She put both hands flat on the tabletop and leaned forward, looking down so that her face was hidden. "You told me you had a horse ranch. You said it was a glorious, magical place in the beautiful mountains, with giant trees towering over your home. You painted a picture in my mind of a fine large estate with paddocks full of mares and stallions and colts frolicking across expansive fields." She slowly raised her head and looked at him, one eyebrow raised. He rubbed his chin and turned in a half-circle looking at the room. He had to admit the house was small, but he'd had so many other things to take care of before he could worry about a big construction project. Beyond the open door he could see out across the front pasture. 3 horses were there, nibbling the verdant green grass. Several more were in another fenced-in area behind the house and there was his mare, still hitched to the buggy out front. "I didn't lie." He turned back to her. "I have 1,000 acres, give or take a few hundred, most in pasture. It winds through the mountains. My horses are the best I could buy, good breeding stock, and several are already gravid." "That is not what makes a ranch," she insisted, and already he was learning her voice and her temperament. He could tell she was teetering on the edge of exploding again. "A ranch has a home that is large and comfortable with a big kitchen and a wide veranda." "No," he argued, shaking his head. "A ranch is a place where large animals are raised. This is a ranch, and because of the amount of land I own, it's a big ranch. Can you dispute the view is anything but magical?" She turned toward the open doorway and he watched her eyes move, examining the scene. "See, it is beautiful," she agreed in a whisper. "But I expected a home, not this shack." He couldn't help but be offended. The place was small, and all the wood was bare, not a painted or varnished piece in the place, but it was no shack. It was strong and weatherproof and there was glass in the window, brought at great expense from San Francisco. But he supposed he'd better get used to compromising right off the bat. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Why then, we'll just build you a bigger one." Her eyes narrowed and her mouth was so tight her lips disappeared. "Now you make fun of me," she hissed. "No one who lives like this can afford to build a fine home." Zeke crossed his arms. He was a husband now, and would provide for his family. Even if the baby on the way wasn't his by rights, it was his by law now. And by God, if she wanted a bigger house he'd build it. The money he'd set aside was for other purposes until he got the ranch off to a good start, but if having a big home was important to her, he'd do it. "Don't you worry about what I can afford. If I say I'll build you a house, by golly I will." She stamped her foot, enraged, and he brought his head back instinctively. "My first husband said I shouldn't worry about his finances, and when he died all he left me was debt. I will not be stuck in such a situation again." At that she picked up the big jar of pickles and heaved it toward Zeke. He dodged to the side but not before the glass container hit his shoulder, changing its trajectory, sending it to the floor where it shattered in a wet mess of glass shards, dill pickles, and briny fluid. He looked at it in horror, his shoulder throbbing, but when he looked up again she was gone. The only sign of her were wet footsteps leading out the door, where she tracked her boots through the pickle juice. Chapter 7. What had felt chilly when she stood still on a ship quickly warmed up as Ramona walked. With how damp the air was, she fancied she might see steam rising from her skin. She kept alongside the road, which had wound a bit through hills as it came up from the town, but hadn't had any major forks that she had noticed, meaning it would be an easy enough path to follow. But what would she do once she got there? Her heart lurched, and for a moment she thought she might cry. She hadn't come all this way seeking a life of wealth and luxury. She had known that life on a ranch involved a lot of hard work for everyone, from the lowest of hands down to the children of the owner. The thought she might be able to see her own hard work pay off, to not just be at the whim of nature and a gambling fool, had kept her optimistic for her entire journey up to the northern coast. Had Zeke told her he had a tiny farm that was just scratching a living out of the earth, she might still have come, confident they could build it into something that would support their family. But he hadn't told her that. He'd told her he had a ranch. The ground still felt spongy beneath her feet, but without all the traffic in what she supposed she had to call a town, there was little mud. Thick grass and moss covered every inch of the soil, so that she felt like she was walking on a slightly squishy cloud. The very softness of the earth tempered her anger, absorbing the shock of every heavy footfall, until soon her pace had slowed. Fog crept in around her, seeming to thicken with every step she took. Up ahead, the rowdy noise of a camp full of nothing but men chilled her blood. These were not men she knew, who had seen her grown from a child into a woman. These were not men surrounded by the civilizing presence of wives and daughters. These were strange men, who willingly went out into the wilderness, in a land where she might honestly be the only woman around for miles. She could turn back, of course. She knew she could, but what would she say if she did? If she went back there and asked him to explain himself or, worse, simply accepted that the promised ranch didn't exist, wouldn't she end up exactly where she had been with Whitaker? Accepting her husband's lies, accepting that she was utterly powerless to do a thing about it. Shawl hugged tighter around her, she stopped walking entirely and cursed herself. Zeke wasn't Whitaker, and she'd known that from the first time she read his advertisement in the paper. Whatever flaws he had, and her dear mother had warned her as a little girl that all people had them and she mustn't always expect perfection, those flaws were his own, not the same ones Whitaker had suffered from. The fog now hid the far side of the road in misty gray shadows. She turned slowly and carefully, to be certain she wouldn't lose her way entirely, and then began walking back toward the ranch. The thought of having to return there and admit she'd run off and then returned on her own was humiliating, but better that than whatever danger a woman alone in the settlement might face. The heavy sounds of hoofbeats squelching in mud came up behind her on the path, from the direction of the camp. "I tell you what, I'm gonna nab me one of them Indian maidens. It's inhumane living this way," one man called out, shouting as though the fog would muffle hearing as well as sight. Perhaps he had no idea how close whoever he was speaking to actually was. "We already got mining up here. I don't know why we don't got us some painted Jezebels," the first man's companion agreed. "Hey, you see that?" She heard rather than saw one of the horses veering off toward her spot on the edge of the road. With a muffled cry of fright, Ramona dove blindly into a tangle of bushes. Chapter 8. Zeke's land wasn't too far inland, and not too elevated from sea level. When fog rolled in, as it often did, Tendrils of mist followed the same path as his wagon trail into the valley between the mountains. Right after Ramona ran off, he figured she just needed some time to herself, and he bent to the task of cleaning up the mess she'd made. More time passed than he realized when he could finally judge the room set back to rights. When he looked outside and saw a white out, his stomach dropped. She was out there in that. He hoped she hadn't gone any further than the barn and was holed up in it, but even that near she could get lost on her way back to the house. He put on a slicker against the moisture and lit a lantern to leave in the window of the house and another to carry with him before stepping outside. Under ordinary circumstances, he liked the fog. It muffled the sound of everything like the snow of his childhood had. But knowing that night was coming and Ramona was unaccounted for made him nervous. He felt his heart stutter and he lay his free hand upon his chest. He just had to find her. She wasn't a stupid woman, so she either stayed close or headed to town. He'd search the ranch and then take one of the horses, one that was sure-footed and familiar with the way, and go further. The barn was larger than the house, as befitted a man whose horses were an investment into his future. Inside it was gloomy, but thankfully no fog had penetrated. He hung the lantern on a large iron hook and put his hands on his slim hips, turning in a circle. "Ramona," he called out. A horse answered from one of the further stalls, a mare who was due to foal any day. Not trusting that his bride might not answer just to give him grief, he checked each stall and in the loft. If anything, the fog had grown thicker while he'd searched the barn. With the lantern in hand, he stepped back outside. A short whistle brought Star, a sturdy horse he'd trained himself. He quickly saddled her, and they began the slow walk toward town. The same path that had taken less than an hour earlier when he'd brought Ramona out to his spread was taking much longer. He estimated he wasn't halfway to town but already an hour in the saddle. The trouble, he lamented, was that he didn't know how long she'd been gone when the fog rolled in. She might have made it all the way to the rough settlement before he'd even gotten the glass cleaned up from the floor. Unfortunately, she would be much safer in the mountains than she would be in town. Humboldt Bay was occupied by drunkards and thieves, miners with nothing to lose, and losers with nothing to show for their miserable lives. A woman in that godless place would be fair game. He urged Star to go a little faster, for Ramona's very life might be in danger. Even though the fog obscured everything beyond an arm's length away, Zeke got the sense he was nearly to the first tents in town, and huge rough stumps showed where trees had once stood. Muffled though sound might be, something made him pause and he pulled on Star's reins, patting her neck to still her. "Who's there?" he called out. "It's me," a small shamed voice cried. "Ramona," he said with great gladness. "Thank God. Move toward my voice if you can." "That's just it," she whimpered. "I can't. My shawl got tangled on something and I fell. I think I've twisted my ankle." Is the baby okay?" Zeke swung one leg over the horse's backside. "See, I have felt it move. But I can't walk." She paused. "I'm sorry. Just keep talking, sweetheart, and I'll come to you." He put his arms out and walked toward the sound of her voice, holding onto Star's reins so that the mare was forced to follow. When it sounded like he was right on top of her, he squatted down and reached out in every direction until he found her lying at the base of a stump. "Gracias a Dios," she cried out when he put his hands on her and drew her up into his arms. She was in front of him on the horse, her back pressed against his chest, one of his hands resting on her middle, the other holding the lantern. Star knew the way home. "Ezekiel? I don't want to fight anymore." "Well, me neither." He hoped whatever bee she'd had under her bonnet had been put to rest after her little adventure. "But I do need to know why you lied to me. Just tell me the truth of your financial situation so I know what to expect." Everything took longer than it did when the air was clear. He had to watch his feet and it was easy to get turned around. He came upon a fence post and felt the rail. He would follow it to the barn and check there before anything else. Chapter 9. "Sweetheart, do you have any idea how new this settlement really is?" Zeke asked. She shook her head, then shifted to rest her head against his shoulder, trying to absorb some of his heat through her back. The wet slicker he wore didn't let much escape, though. Fairly new, yes? I know Mexico never built anything here. It began this year. I put that ad in the newspaper before I actually arrived here. Everything you saw on my property has been there for less time than that baby you're carrying has been alive. Words failed her. The mission Santa Barbara was nearly 70 years old, and it was not a particularly old one, as far as these things went. It put the somewhat horrifying conditions of the settlement into perspective. There likely hadn't been time to build much. That Zeke had managed as much as he had seemed impressive now, and yet it only filled her with more questions. Why would you come out to this place, she pressed. I had a friend who was on one of the earliest expeditions and wrote to me about it. With this gold rush bringing all these people west, I figured I'd better jump on an opportunity when it was presented, because I doubt another would come up again. She couldn't fault him for that. Her own Spanish ancestors had come to the New World seeking opportunities, intermarrying with the indigenous people they found there, building up what wealth they could. Her father's shop would have been a good investment in the future for her children someday, had Whitaker not sold it off within days of her father's funeral to pay for his own gambling debts. But still, he had come all the way from New York to set up this ranch, having to build it all from scratch. She sighed softly. How much debt are you in? Debt? Zeke shifted slightly in his saddle to try to look around her body at her face. Sweetheart, I'm not in any debt. I still have a fair chunk of my inheritance left. Tell me about your inheritance. There was no suspicion in her voice this time, only honest curiosity. This was to be their life together, the legacy her children would inherit. My father was a successful man. He owned one of the biggest farms in upstate New York, and he always prided himself on how well he provided for us. There was always good food on the table. Plenty of meat, every pastry you could imagine. He loved life like no one I've ever known. Genuine warmth worked into Zeke's voice, and though she couldn't see his face, she could imagine his smile. She gripped his arm in a rush of unexpected affection. You loved your father very much. Oh yes. Then Zeke's voice took on a mournful tone. He suffered from dropsy and angina, so was sick for some years towards the end and stopped doing much around the property, which only seemed to make him sicker. In the end, we think it was apoplexy that took him. She closed her eyes, almost lulled to sleep by the gentle rhythm of the horse walking. I'm so sorry. My father also died of apoplexy. It still stings, but while my older brother inherited the farm, us younger brothers got a share of the family wealth. He nuzzled against her cheek affectionately, making her sigh. I can show you my ledger when we get home if you're really worried. It's hard for me not to worry, after the way my first husband lied to me, but... She shook her head. I'd like to be involved in the bookkeeping and anything else I can, but not because I'm worried. I just want this to be our ranch. Our home together. His arms tightened around her, drawing her into the cradle of his embrace. It will be. Chapter 10. Zeke leaned against the split rail fence and watched the latest foalborn on the ranch scamper around. It was a sunny September day, and he tipped his head back, closing his eyes against the brightness, and smiled. Things were looking up. The numbers of his horses had increased, as had the population of the nearby town. Already he'd had inquiries from miners wanting pack animals, sturdy ponies that could carry supplies for the men who lived in the mountains. While that wasn't exactly the kind of horseflesh he wanted to raise and train, he was no fool and wouldn't turn away business. Things had even been going better with Ramona. She was a hard worker, in spite of being heavy with the weight of her baby. She threw herself into keeping house and seldom complained, though he noticed that when she had a spare moment she could be found, pencil in hand, working on a plan for a house. He'd looked over her shoulder once and caught a glimpse of it, sprawling with many rooms, 3 stories high, long wide porches and a huge kitchen. Why do you need all those rooms? He'd asked, and she swatted at him and put her papers away. The foal's mother came up to him at the fence and nudged his hand, and he absent-mindedly scratched her forelock. He supposed if Ramona wanted that big house, he'd have to build it for her. A sound came from the house and he turned to look. She was standing at the door, one hand supporting her low belly, the other holding onto the door jamb. Something about her stance alarmed him. He wasn't sure what, and he started walking determinedly toward her. About halfway there he heard her cry out and he started to run. There were still no women in the town, and certainly no midwives. The only doctor was self-educated and of questionable ability, more likely to cause damage than healing. Zeke and Ramona had talked about what they'd do when her time came, and she'd assured him that she would do as her own mother had done. She would birth her baby in her home with her husband nearby. "Is it?" he managed to croak out when he reached her. "See, I've been ignoring them, but I can't ignore it any longer. Shouldn't you be in bed?" He fussed about her, pulling on her to bring her away from the door. No, my mother told me it's best to birth standing." Her eyes closed and she breathed slowly and deeply. "What should I do?" She warned. "Why? What's going on?" Another deep breath and she opened her eyes. "Zeke, please be quiet. It takes all my concentration to stay calm. I've prepared a birthing stick and chosen a spot where I can look at the mountain." "What?" He was flabbergasted. Was she suggesting she was going to give birth outdoors? "Here, let me show you." She led the way around the house to a pretty spot of soft green grass. A woven mat lay on the ground, with several towels folded neatly there as well. A long staff like a walking stick was placed crosswise on the mat. With the stick in both hands, she leaned forward, letting it support her as wave after wave of birthing pains swept over her. He'd watched enough horses foal to know that what he was witnessing was not very different, but he guessed that most women back east didn't birth that way. The energy of her contractions changed, and this time when it rolled over her she dropped down a little and raised her head to the mountain before her. There, looking toward the vibrant green redwoods with the golds and reds of deciduous trees threaded through, she sang out a noise that was half cry and half music. The horses all lifted their heads and whinnied, and Zeke got chills. Ramona dropped to her knees, the staff falling away from her, and reached beneath her dress, lifting up the red body of a child who strangely made no noise but looked around instead, his eyes wide and dark, a thatch of black hair on his scalp. "A son," she cried out, triumphant, and her voice echoed. Later, inside, where Zeke insisted they go, with Ramona tucked up in bed and the infant nestled in her arms nursing noisily, he brought 2 cups of tea liberally laced with honey and sat down beside her. She took a sip and leaned back against the pillows behind her head and smiled. "I am very happy right now," she murmured. "Even in this shack," he teased. She shrugged, but her smile didn't falter. "What will you name your son, Ramona?" She waited so long he thought maybe she'd forgotten to answer. The child finished feeding and she held him out toward Zeke. I think that I will give you that task." Instinctively he took the baby into his arms and looked down into his face. Instead of a vacant expression, as he had expected, there was intelligence and interest in the child's gaze. "I think we should name him James, after my father. His grandfather. Are you sure you don't want to save that name for the next boy, your real son?" She bit her lip, and a crease formed between her dark brows. He looked down into the child's face, and the boy looked back steadily. "No," Zeke breathed. "No, this is my real son." The end.